guys, what do you see behind me? It's a cage. Why would anyone have a cage in their office? Well, it's to protect my books from my new puppy. We got a puppy last Friday, and for my husband Mark, for a hiking dog, and she is 2 months old, and she is a little black fuzzball. She is what they call a golden shepherd, but she's not golden, she's black, unless the sun's shining on her, and then she is brown. But she is so sweet and so fluffy, and I'm up late. Let's see, what time is it? It's 1:45 in the morning. Ugh. But I'm making pastrami brisket, so that means I'm kind of up in the middle of the night. And I have to record this while she's sleeping with my husband, because otherwise she'd be in here whining because she could hear me talk, and she does not like it when I'm not with her, 24 hours a day. But I can't do that. I can't do that. Oh, I need some tea for caffeine. All right. See how tired I am? Anyway, let's do this week's broadcast. All right. Hi, I'm Miss Tyler, and welcome to this week's episode of Context for Kids, where I teach you guys stuff most adults don't even know. So if this is your first time hearing, or if you've missed anything, you can find all the episodes archived at contextforkids.podbean.com, which has them downloadable, or at Context for Kids, where I have transcripts for readers, or on my Context for Kids YouTube channel, where I usually post slightly longer video versions. All scripture this week comes from the MTV, the Miss Tyler version, which is the Christian Standard Bible, tweaked a little or a lot to make the context and the content more understandable to kids. I love Bible movies, don't get me wrong. But sometimes I forget that they're just interpretations of what the Bible says instead of what actually happened. What's an interpretation? Well, every time you or I or anyone reads something and decide what it says, we are interpreting what we're reading. We're deciding what it means. Sometimes interpreting something means that we're taking one language and translating it to another, because some things we say in one language don't mean the same thing in the new language. Remember back in episode 1 when we played the idiom game and I told you all the funny things that people say in different languages that sound like total nonsense in English? How when someone in Japan says stinky like fish, it means that they want you to come and visit them again soon. In English, it sounds like they're saying you smell bad and you need to take a bath. And we have things we say in English that are absolutely ridiculous when we don't know what they mean, like, don't let the cat out of the bag. And how it means that we have to be sure to keep a secret and not tell anyone. Like, if you know about a surprise party, and if you tell everyone, then you spoil the surprise. But if someone doesn't know about that, they might think you actually have a cat inside the bag, and that's just mean. Except with my cat, Bubba. If you put a garbage bag on the floor, he will crawl inside because he loves being taken from one room to another in the garbage bag. I have never had another cat who did that. They would be scared, but not Bubba. He's weird. Bubba thinks that everything in the world is fun. Don't put your cat in the bag, okay? God created us to care for animals, and being inside the bag and not leaving it was his idea and not mine. It's a long story how it happened the first time. But there are other ways to interpret things. Today we're going to talk about Sarah laughing in Genesis 18, and if you've watched Bible movies, you might assume that however they made her laugh look was what the Bible means. But the truth is, we don't know what her laugh sounded like. Was she rolling her eyes and shaking her head because what she was hearing sounded stupid to her? Or because too many people had made her the same promise too many times? Or was she actually happy and hopeful but not certain it was true? We don't know. The Bible doesn't say. But that doesn't mean we can't talk about it and learn a lot and play the what if game. We haven't done that in a long time, so this week will be the perfect time to try it again. As a quick review, 3 mysterious visitors came to the camp of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham went out to meet them and invited them to rest and eat. This is called hospitality, and it was very important in the ancient world. It was a way to make friends out of enemies and to gain honor by being generous. The guests weren't allowed to ask for anything, and the host wasn't allowed to ask their guests any questions about what they were doing. So up to now, they've just been eating the bread, milk, curds, and meat that Abraham had brought them. They had washed their feet with the water Abraham brought. And Abraham is taking care of them personally. Unable to ask them anything about who they are and why they were there and where they were going. We know from verse 1 that God is there. And we know from Genesis 19, the next chapter, we know that the other 2 are angels. This is a theophany, an appearance of God. We talked about that last week. The man isn't what God looks like because we know from other places in the Bible that no one has ever seen what God the Father really looks like. But God can appear in a burning bush as the angel of the Lord, and so he can certainly make himself look like a man or anything else if he wants to. We still don't know why God is here, but we're about to find out. Let's look at today's verses, starting in Genesis 18, verse 9. "Where is your wife Sarah?" the 3 visitors asked him. "There, inside the tent," Abraham answered. "The Lord said, I will come back to you in about a year from now, and your wife Sarah will have a son. I guarantee it." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent behind the Lord. Abraham and Sarah were already old and getting even older. Sarah was way too old to have babies, so she laughed to herself. Now that I'm old and worn out and my husband's even older than I am, will I be a mom? But the Lord asked Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, 'Can I really have a baby when I'm old?' Is anything impossible for the Lord? I will come back to you exactly when I said I would, and in about a year, Sarah will have a son." Sarah was too scared now to admit she'd been laughing, so she lied to him. "I didn't laugh." But he replied, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." Uh-oh. Do you remember what happened in the last chapter? The exact same thing. Abraham heard God's promise to give him a son with Sarah, and he fell down and laughed too. It said, Abraham fell down on his face. Then he laughed and said to himself, "Can I have another son when I'm 100 years old? Can Sarah have a baby? She's almost 90 years old." So I have questions because obviously Abraham knew it was God himself who had made that promise in the last chapter. And this promise from the visitors is exactly the same, so Abraham must know exactly who he's talking to now. But Sarah seems like she hasn't ever heard any of this before. She's reacting like it's news to her, at least the way I'm reading and interpreting this. Didn't Abraham tell her? Why wouldn't he tell her? And why wouldn't Sarah be dazzled and know right away that this was the Lord talking about her having a baby? So many questions. Let's start at the beginning so we can try to unravel what's going on. Well, the first really strange thing here is that these strangers, somehow they know Sarah's name. Not Sarai even, which she was still being called before God changed it just a few days before. No, they called her Sarah, and that was still brand new even to Abraham. Had he even told anyone about it? Had he started to call her Sarah like the Lord commanded him to do? I think that when Abraham heard them call her Sarah, he knew it was the Lord, but we don't know if Sarah had caught how strange it was that they called her by that name. Sarah was in the tent right behind them listening, which makes perfect sense since it wasn't right for her to be out with the men in that culture. And remember that Abraham liked to keep her away from other men because she was so beautiful. But Sarah still wanted to know about whatever exciting news the visitors had brought from the outside world. I mean, that was the best part of having visitors. Where is your wife, Sarah? Is a rather strange question from strangers in those days. You didn't just go asking your host personal questions about the women in their household. It was a pretty sketchy thing to do. I think the only reason Abraham even answered them is because he finally realized that these weren't just normal guys on a journey. Probably no one else knew about her new name at this point, apart from God and Abraham and maybe Sarah. God did command him to call her by that name, but we don't know if Abraham shared with her the reason why. After all, not being able to have a baby was something that had hurt Sarah badly for the last 70 years once they figured out there was a problem that wouldn't go away. How many times had people over the years told her that it would happen if she would just stop worrying about it? I know a lot of people told me that, and it just made me hurt worse and worse, and I was more and more ashamed. How many people had told her that, she couldn't have a baby because the gods were angry at her and she was cursed, and if she would just do this or that, everything would be okay. And I'm sure she did all those things, and it just never helped. So their suggestions would have hurt her too, made her feel ashamed. Everyone was telling her that it was all her fault. Today we know better, but then they figured that having babies was the simplest thing on earth. Today we know that's one of the most complicated, and it really is a miracle. So it could be that Abraham just couldn't get her hopes up again because Sarah didn't ever really have any sort of relationship with God. Only Abraham did at this point, and not anyone else. It wasn't like it is today when millions and millions of people do. Men and women and girls and boys and old and young and speaking thousands of different languages. I don't think Abraham told her anything about God's promise, and I can't blame him for that. So when the stranger said that Sarah would be a mom in another year, she probably believed that they were just responding to the hospitality. Do you remember the rules for people who became guests in someone else's home? They weren't allowed to ask for anything they hadn't been given. They couldn't act like enemies and hurt their host or his city. And they had to give the host a blessing of life at the end. Sarah had probably spent all of her life hearing things like, "May the gods reward you with 100 sons, and may your wife be like a fruitful vine." That was considered to be polite and the right thing to do. It was just normal. And so when these men said that to Abraham, I don't think she got excited and heard it as a promise from God. I think she just rolled her eyes and thought to herself, same old, if I had a piece of silver for every time I've heard that blessing, I've had so many people tell me that their prayers for me would guarantee me a baby, but no matter how hard I believed or good I tried to be, it never happened. Sarah understood that too. Now, it wasn't her fault, and it wasn't my fault. If Abraham told her, would she believe it? Should she? Even if he did tell her, Why would a group of strangers saying it impress her? The Bible said that Sarah laughed to herself. I don't know if that means so quietly that she didn't think anyone would hear, or if she just laughed on the inside. You know how sometimes we just laugh on the inside when we would get in trouble for laughing in a way that people can hear it? If you can't do that yet, you'll learn. It's one of the ways we learn to control ourselves as we get older. Sometimes it's a big part of kindness. It wouldn't have been kind for Sarah to respond to what sounded like a blessing by laughing and making fun of the visitors for saying it. Sometimes when we've been angry and sad for a long time about something, like Sarah with not being able to have babies, we say and think things that aren't very nice because it hurts so bad. Sarah's response on the inside, maybe what she said to herself is, "What? I'm so old and my body's worn out. My husband's even older and more worn out than I am. Am I supposed to finally be able to have a baby now?" Now that would be a sarcastic response, which is always angry and mean. But what if Abraham did tell her and she's surprised to hear it again? Maybe then we could read it more like this. Can this be true? But don't they know how old I am and how worn out my body is? Too old for having babies. And my husband's even older than I am. Is it possible that I could finally have what I wanted my whole life? How do we know which one's right? Well, we can't entirely. When Moses first told the story to the children of Israel in the wilderness, he knew the right way to say everything, so people would know for sure just through the sound of his voice. I mean, we can listen to people talking and hear if they're happy or angry or confused or whatever. But what did Sarah's laugh sound like? Did it sound sarcastic like, "Oh, sure, whatever"? Or how about hilarious? "Oh my gosh, are they serious? Look at me and look at him. We're supposed to have a baby. That's hilarious." Bah! Or maybe just unable to really believe it, even though she's hoping it's true. What? Could something like this really happen to us when we're old? Well, Moses knew exactly how to say it, but we can only guess. Once people started writing everything down, it got harder and harder to remember how to say it. That's why hearing a story can be a lot better than reading a story. That's how they used to do things before they built places where they could store things that were written down. Was God surprised that Sarah laughed? Do you remember what God told Abraham after he laughed? God said that their baby would be called Isaac, and Isaac, or Yitzhak, means laughter. Abraham laughed. Sarah laughed. And Sarah will later say that everyone who hears the story about it would laugh too. God was about to make something happen that was unbelievable. We're even laughing today because it's just crazy for this to happen to a 90-year-old lady and a 100-year-old guy. Now, God seems to maybe be angry with Sarah, but it's hard to know because we can't hear the tone of his voice either. Maybe he's laughing at her laughing, or maybe he's unhappy because Abraham didn't tell her and she seems to be totally taken by surprise. Or maybe Sarah's laughter is angry and God needs her to understand that he's dealing with her now. And she needs to realize that he can do anything he promises to do, so he's being firm and serious with her. I don't think he's really angry because God would understand that Sarah's been disappointed all her life and gave up on having a baby a long time ago. One way or another, Sarah needs a reality check, and she needs to begin to have faith again like she probably did when she was still young. Remember that Sarah grew up as an idol worshiper, just like Abraham, and she is used to the gods letting her down. How should she know that Abraham's God is any different? God needs Sarah to believe, and Sarah needs to know that she can trust God. God is going to prove to her that she can trust him and that he can do anything he decides to do. Sarah's being quiet and only talking to herself, so just imagine how shocking and scary it would be when one of the strangers said, "Why did Sarah laugh?" And then to make matters worse, he read her mind and told Abraham all about it. Well, most of it. God was very kind to Sarah and didn't tell Abraham how old she thought he was. Well, like he didn't know. That would just be mean for no reason at all. I don't know about you, but if someone heard me laugh to myself and then told me exactly what I was thinking, I would be totally freaking out. I wouldn't want anyone to know that person was right. I would be so scared of what they might say next. One of the best things about our private thoughts is that they are private. No one knows them except for us and God. But in Sarah's world of pagan gods and goddesses, they couldn't read minds. They had no idea what people were thinking, only what they saw people do and heard them say. Now, Sarah did what a lot of us might do when scared. She just up and lied. Remember that Sarah isn't a Christian and she isn't Jewish either. She's chosen by God to be the mom of the universe's first impossible baby. There will be 7 of these babies in the entire Bible, but this one will be the first. This means that she hasn't even ever heard about anything like this happening before. The ancient world had a lot of what are called fertility gods and goddesses. That means they were in charge of making sure that crops grew and made seeds, like fruits and vegetables and wheat, and that animals and people had lots of babies. Of course, they really couldn't do anything of the sort. Plants and animals and people have seeds and babies because God created them to do that. And all the false gods could do was to take credit for what God had done. Each culture in the ancient world had a few of these, and they were all very different, even though they had the same jobs. But our God, Yahweh, wanted to make everyone know that he can do things that none of their fake gods could take credit for. He could make an old woman have a baby, one who's never even had a baby before. And everyone knew it because they'd been with Sarah and Abraham for a long time. Sarah felt ashamed, sad, and probably even angry. It was very hard to hope with all her heart for something like a baby while everyone around her was having babies from the time she was a teenager and newly married. But right now, I figure that Sarah's completely freaked out and confused and not sure what to think. All right? I bet you she had a long talk with Abraham later that day about what the heck's going on. Abraham, who are those men and why would they talk to me like that? It's one thing to give us a blessing because we took them in, but that one guy, he knew that I was laughing about what he said, and I did not make a peep. More than that, he told me exactly what I was thinking and how on earth did they know my name. I was in here making bread the whole time, and you never said a word about me. Abraham, I'm scared. Were they sorcerers or magicians? How did they do that? And what's all this about? They talked about your God. I heard them use his name. No one else around here uses that name. What am I missing here? And maybe Abraham would have to tell her everything that had happened and why he was calling her Sarah, and God's promise to give her a son named Isaac, and how he'd fallen down laughing because of how old they were. And if all that happened, then I'm sure the very first thing they thought of was what a mess they had made with Abraham's son Ishmael. How much they had complicated everything by being impatient and not trusting God to give Abraham a son his own way. But learning that God doesn't need us to come up with plans to make his promises happen is hard for everyone. Let me tell you a story about something that happened about 20 years ago. I was at a church and the pastor there went to a conference one December. A man walked up to him and told him that God wanted him to hear a certain verse, which he shared with him. And then another guy comes up to him and says, God has told me that your ministry will increase 5 times what it is now. Well, that pastor was very happy and he started making big plans. Without telling anyone, he bought the church a new piece of land and made plans to build a church 5 times the size of the one we were using. And he put up our church building as collateral, which means that if the church couldn't pay the bills on the land that the pastor had bought, that we would lose our church building. But he was wrong. The way he was interpreting God's promise was entirely wrong. He was thinking that having a ministry get bigger was about having more people in a bigger building, but that wasn't what God had in mind at all. God wanted the work of the church to get bigger and not the building. And the congregation lost the land and lost the church building too. And the pastor just moved somewhere else like nothing had happened. If they would have just kept doing what they were doing, then God would have made his own promises come true. That's always the way with things with God. God said Abraham would have a son, but God never said how or when. It's only when we trust God that we wait for him to show us what his promises mean. But now Abraham and Sarah have this promise, even if Sarah doesn't quite know what to believe yet. After all, she hasn't been visited by angels or had visions, and they certainly didn't have the land, and they weren't a great nation, and Abraham didn't even have a great name at this point. They had faced famine and childlessness, and they were still wanderers with no home. They had a lot of stuff, which was great. But without a home and a son, it must have seemed meaningless to Sarah. After all, if Abraham died at this point, there was nothing to save Sarah from being thrown out of the camp by Hagar and Ishmael. If that's what Ishmael wanted, because he would be in charge. We haven't had anything to do with Ishmael yet, and so we don't know how he felt about Sarah, but it probably wasn't very positive since she'd been so mean to his mom and was still using her as a slave, even though her son Ishmael was the second most important guy in the household. That's just awkward. When we try to work things out ourselves, we just make a big mess for everyone. Ishmael the person wasn't a mistake because people aren't mistakes. But it was a mistake for Abraham and Sarah not to wait on God because Isaac was always his plan from the beginning. I love you. I'm praying for you. I hope you'll try to remember as you get older that you don't have to have things all figured out. God doesn't need you to figure out a way to make his plans work out. All you need to do is become more like Jesus and let him make things happen in his own time and in his own ways.